Chapter 13 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Chapter 13. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The beauty of Israel has fallen in its high place, said the voice of Emerson's friend and neighbor, Judge Hoar, trembling and almost hushed in emotion, and everybody who heard felt the singular felicity of the words. The plain little country church was crowded, and a vast throng stood outside in the peaceful April sunshine. Before the pulpit, the eyes forever closed, the voice forever silent, lay the man whose aspect of sweet and majestic serenity death had not touched, and which recalled his own words: "Even the corpse that has lain in the chambers has added a solemn ornament to the house." It was the man who was beloved of his neighbors and honored by the world, whose modest counsel in grave affairs guided the village, and whose thoughts led the thought of Christendom. He belonged to all men, but he is peculiarly ours, said Judge Hoar truly, speaking for the quiet, historic town of which Emerson's grandfather had been the minister, and in which he lived during the larger part of his life, and to which his memory will lend an imperishable charm. Concord, when he first knew it, was already famous. 100 years ago, at the bridge over the placid river, the Middlesex farmers, hastening as minute-men from all the neighboring country, had obeyed the first military summons to fire upon the King's regulars, and the red-coated regulars, turning, had begun, amid the blazing patriot folly of 20 miles, their long retreat to Yorktown and over the sea. At the point where the highway by which the soldiers march enters the village, under the hill along whose ridge the hurrying countrymen pressed to cut off the soldiers' retreat, lived for more than 40 years the scholar who belongs to Concord, as Shakespeare belongs to Stratford. Nature, said Emerson in his first book, written in the old manse at Concord, which Hawthorne afterwards inhabited, and which he has so beautifully commemorated, Nature stretcheth out her arms to embrace man, only let his thoughts be of equal greatness. Willingly does she follow his steps with the rose and the violet, and bend her lines of grandeur and grace to the decoration of her darling child. Only let his thoughts be of equal scope, and the frame will suit the picture. A virtuous man is in unison with her works, and makes the central figure of the visible sphere. Homer, Pindar, Socrates, Phocion, associate themselves fitly in our memory with the geography and climate of Greece. The visible heavens and the earth sympathize with Jesus, and in common life whoever has seen a person of powerful character and happy genius will have remarked how easily he took all things along with him, the persons, the opinions, and the day, and nature became auxiliary to a man. So is Emerson associated with the tranquil landscape of the old Middlesex town, the gentle hills, the long sweep of meadowland, the winding river, the woodland, and the pastures under the ample sky. The broad horizon and rural repose were the fitting home of the lofty and beneficent genius whose life and word perpetually illustrated the supreme worth and beauty of truth, purity, and morality. Whoever saw him there or elsewhere saw the sweet and virtuous soul which George Herbert likened to seasoned timber that never gives. The sincerity and serenity of Emerson's character were unsurpassed. The freshness and glow of his interest in life were perennial. With a sober tenderness of regret he said to a friend who congratulated him upon his 70th birthday, "Yet it is a little sad to me, for I count today the end of youth." In no other sense than the lapse of years, however, was it true. That auroral freshness of soul which is the distinctive charm of youth lingered when even memory somewhat failed. "How long it is since I have seen you," he said at Longfellow's funeral to a friend whom he had accosted just before. But he said it with all that heartiness of sympathy and expectation which, in the golden prime of his life, when he was in many ways the most striking and original figure in his country, made him greet every comer as if he expected to hear from him a wiser word than had yet been spoken. A youth, fascinated by this simple graciousness of manner, declared that Emerson greeted the most ordinary persons like a king of Spain receiving an ambassador from the Great Mogul. The expectancy of his manner implied that every man had some message to deliver, and he bent himself to hear. But his shrewdness of perception was exquisite. He did not take dross because he hoped for gold. His reproof was as sure and incisive as the stroke of a delicate Damascus blade. When a young man, hearing Emerson say that everybody ought to read Plato, followed his advice and read, he thought, with the audacity of youth, that he detected faults in Plato, and wrote an essay to set them forth. He asked Emerson to read it, and when he returned it to the youth, Emerson said pleasantly, "My boy, when you strike at the king, you must kill him." One day he sat at dinner with a distinguished company of statesmen. He was by far the most famous man at the table, but he modestly followed the conversation, turning from each guest who spoke to the next with the old sweet gravity of earnest expectation. When all the notable company had gone, a guest who remained said to him, "I saw you talking with the English minister. He is a brilliant man, and I hope you found him agreeable." "A very pleasant gentleman," replied Emerson, "but he does not represent the England that I know." Despite this sharp apprehension, however, Emerson was sometimes unable to find any charm in writings which have apparently taken a permanent place in literature. He could see nothing interesting or valuable in Shelley. "When I read Shelley," he once said, "I am like a man who thinks that he sees gold at the bottom of a stream. He reaches for it, but his hands come up cold with a little common sand in them." The waywardness and disorder of Shelley's life may have troubled him, but this would not have affected his intellectual judgment. His acute intellect was supremely independent and absolutely courageous. "He must embrace solitude as a bride," he said of the scholar. "He must have his glees and his glooms alone." When as a young man he quietly closed his pulpit door and declined to preach any more because he no longer felt any value in certain religious rites, there was no protest, nor ostentation, nor newspaper sensation. It was simply the closing of a book that he had read, and the amazement and censure and grief of others could not possibly persuade him to do, or to say, or to affect the thing that was not true. Emerson's moral and intellectual integrity was transparently simple, but it was sublime. It was not expressed in stormy self-assertion nor cynical contempt. It spoke in tranquil and beautiful affirmation, perfectly courteous but absolutely sincere. But no man more charitably and diligently sought to understand others, and to be just to what was obscure and foreign to him. He listened patiently to music, but it did not charm him. He was punctual in the duties of a citizen, but he had no proper political tastes. Yet for the true politics, the application of the moral law to the control of public affairs, no man was more perceptive or uncompromising. He was always on the right side of great public questions. His hospitable sympathy entertained every good cause, and in all our anti-slavery literature there is no nobler or more permanent work than his address upon the anniversary of West India emancipation in 1844. The only cloud that ever arose upon his regard for Carlyle was his displeasure with Carlyle's contemptuous and cynical sneers at our Civil War. He was deeply impatient of doubtful and half-hearted Americans during the war. "They call themselves gentlemen, I believe," he said of certain persons, and in a tone which showed that his lofty and patriotic honor instinctively and utterly repudiated the pinchbeck claims of educated feebleness to bear the grand old name of gentleman. Those who recall Emerson when he was a clergyman in Boston remember a singular spiritual beauty in the man, and an indescribable charm of manner in his public speech. But apparently he impressed his earlier associates with the purity and refinement of his mind and life, his lofty intellectual tastes and sympathy, and his literary accomplishment, rather than by the peculiar force of a genius which was to give the most powerful spiritual impulse of the generation to American thought. This is the more singular because there was always something breezy and heroic in his tone, which might have led to the suspicion of the fact that he was from the first a fond reader of Plutarch, from whose lives he draws so many illustrations. As in a mountain walk the traveler is suddenly aware of wafts of perfumed air, now of the wild grape blossom, now of the azalea or sweetbrier, so the strain of Emerson suggests his sympathy with Plutarch and Montaigne, the Oriental poets and the Platonists. But no one could describe accurately his system of philosophy nor fit him into a school of poetry. He was content to call himself a scholar, and no name was more significant and precious to him. He shunned notoriety, but he had the instinctive desire of every artist and of all genius for an audience. When a friend asked him of a young man whose literary talent had seemed to him to promise great achievement, Emerson said, "He does nothing, and I doubted his genius when I saw that he did not seek a hearing." When his own first slight volume, Nature, was published, they were but a very few, who perceived in it the ripe and beautiful work of a master in literature and thought. The richness and originality and picturesque simplicity of this book, its subtle perception, its tone of jubilant power, and the soft, glimmering light of lofty imagination which irradiates every page, do not lose by familiarity, and are as charming, although of course not so surprising, as when they first took captive the readers of nearly 50 years ago. With the eagerness of classification which characterizes many active minds, Emerson was immediately labeled a Berkeleyan, an idealist and a mystic, but he eluded the precise classification as noiselessly and surely as a cloud changes its form. Astonishment, satire, indignation, contradiction, spent themselves in vain. Like a rose tree in June, which blossoms sweetly whether the air be chilly or sunny, his thought quietly flowered into exquisite expression. You might like it or leave it, but the rose would be still a rose. There was a fashion of calling Emerson obscure, but there is no style in literature of more poetic precision than his. It is full of surprises, of beauty and aptness. His central doctrine of the identity of men, the grandeur of every man's opportunity, and the essential poetry of the circumstances of common life, was a living faith. The great man, he said, makes the great thing. In the sighing of these woods, in the quiet of these gray fields, in the cool breeze that sings out of these northern mountains, in the workmen, the boys, the maidens you meet, in the hopes of the morning, the ennui of noon, and the sauntering of the afternoon, in the disquieting comparisons, in the regrets at want of vigor, in the great idea and the puny execution, behold Charles V.'s day. Another, yet the same. Behold Chatham's, Hampden's, Bayard's, Alfred's, Scipio's, Pericles' day. Day of all that are born of women. The difference of circumstance is merely costume. I am tasting the self-same life, its sweetness, its greatness, its pain, which I so admire in other men. The temptation to complete the splendid passage is almost irresistible, but in every page you are drawn on as in a stately symphony of winning music. This passage is from the Dartmouth College address, and it has all the flowing cadence of a discourse written to be spoken. Yet Emerson had little of the orator's temperament save the desire of an audience and an earnestness which was pure and not passionate. But no orator in the country has exercised a deeper or more permanent influence. His discourses were but essays, but their thought was so noble, their form so symmetrical, their tone so lofty, and they were spoken with such alluring rhythm that they threw over young minds a spell which no other eloquence could command. Emerson himself was very susceptible to the power of fine oratory. No man ever praised more warmly the charm of Everett in his earlier day. When Webster delivered his eulogy upon Adams and Jefferson in Faneuil Hall, Emerson was teaching in Cambridge, and Richard H. Dana, Jr., was one of his pupils. The day before Webster spoke, the teacher announced that there would be no school upon the morrow, and he earnestly exhorted his pupils not to lose the memorable opportunity of hearing the great orator. Dana was of an age to prefer fishing to oratory, and strolled off with his line to the river, where he passed the day. When school was resumed, Mr. Emerson, with sympathetic interest, asked him if he had heard Webster. The fisher, half ashamed, reluctantly owned his absence. Emerson looked at him with regret and almost pain, and said to him gravely, "My boy, I am very sorry. You have lost what you can never recover, and what you will regret to the last day of your life." But those who heard his own Divinity School address, or the Cambridge or Dartmouth oration, or the Emancipation address, would not exchange that recollection even to have heard the Olympian orator in Faneuil Hall. "Tell me," said a senator famous for his oratory to a friend in Washington, "what do you call eloquence? Repeat to me an eloquent passage." The friend quoted from Emerson the unequaled passage from the Dartmouth College address, in which the scholar appeals to the young men to be true to the ideals of their youth. a passage which no generous youth can read today without deep emotion and a thrill of high resolve. The senator listened with an air of perplexed incredulity. "Do you call that eloquent? Now see what I call eloquence," and he declaimed a glowing piece of rhetoric with ardent feeling. It was a passage from Charles Sprague's 4th of July oration in Boston 60 years ago. But effective as it was, his friend reminded the senator that if the test of eloquence be glow of feeling and splendor and sincerity of expression, with an inner power of appeal which searches the hearts and molds the life, no really greater results in this country could be traced to any speech than to that of Emerson, who read the greater part of his essays as addresses, and who sometimes reached a lyrical strain which not the magnificent Burke nor any other great orator surpasses. To talk of Emerson, even if the talker were not of the circle of his intimate friends, is to raise the floodgate of happy and inspiring recollections. It is one of the tenderest of the thoughts that hover around his memory, as the low winds sigh through the pine trees over his grave, that, as with Longfellow, there are no excuses to be made for grotesque eccentricities of genius, nor for a life at any point unworthy of so great a soul. He said of his friend Thoreau, who was buried near him, that he was like the Alpine climber who gathers the edelweiss, the flower that blooms at the very edge of the glacier. He too lived at those pure heights, and taught us how to tread them undazzled and undismayed. Happy teacher, whose long and lovely life illustrated the dignity and excellence of the truth, old as the morning and as ever fresh, that fidelity to the divine law written upon the conscience is the only safe law of life for every man. Noble and beneficent preacher, who, in a sense that the pensive Goldsmith did not intend, allured to brighter worlds, and led the way. End of section 13. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 14 from the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Henry Ward Beecher. For 40 years Mr. Beecher had been minister of Plymouth Church, when on a Sunday morning suddenly came the news that his ministry and probably his life were ended, and he died a day or two afterwards. The preacher and the church were more widely known than any others in the Union, and during all his pastorate he was one of the most conspicuous figures in the country. He was undoubtedly also one of the most famous preachers of his time and of the English race, and the death of Wendell Phillips left him the most eminent of American orators. There have been popular preachers during Mr. Beecher's career, like Moffat and other revivalists, and there are always eloquent and scholarly orators in the American pulpit. The tradition of Summerfield presents a beautiful youth and a captivating speaker. The charm of Channing was profound and indescribable. But Beecher recalls Whitefield more than any other renowned preacher. Like Whitefield, he was what is known as a man of the people, a man of strong virility, of exuberant vitality, of quick sympathy, of an abounding humor, of a rapid play of poetic imagination, of great fluency of speech, an emotional nature overflowing in ardent expression, of strong convictions, of complete self-confidence, but also not sensitive, nor critical, nor judicial, a hearty, joyous nature, touching ordinary human life at every point, and responsive to every generous moral impulse. Mr. Beecher was not a pioneer, nor a leader of forlorn hopes, but of the main column of the army. He marched just ahead of the advance, and touched with his elbows those who moved forward with him. He liked to feel the warmth of their breath upon his cheek, and the magnetism of their neighborhood. He spoke for them as they could not speak for themselves. He liked the crowd. The hum and throb of multitudinous life inspired and cheered him. He was at home in the streets and towns, with a bright jest for every comer, a happy quip in repartee, with an eye and a heart for the unfortunate and forlorn, and a ready rebuke for insolence and injustice. He had nothing of the recluse or scholarly habit, no fastidious taste. He was fond of pictures and music and all forms of art, without a special aesthetic accomplishment. A man of cheery presence, of cordial address, with a willing word for the reporter, chaffing the interviewer, jumping on the street car in motion, yet always seemly, and always, despite his slouched hat and careless dress, undeniably clerical, but with no undue professional sense of dignity or decorum. In the pulpit, or more truly upon the platform, for whether preaching or lecturing or speaking at table or upon the stump, he seemed to be always upon the platform. He inculcated right living rather than traditional doctrine. He was a soldier of the church militant, but his warfare was with human wrong and misery, and false theories of life, and low aims and poor ambitions. He aimed to build up righteousness of life, and in the ardor of the strife he liked to pause and wink, and let fly a bright-tipped, winged word at the opponent against whom he bore no kind of malice. He hated the wrong, but not the wrong-doer. Ardent and impulsive, his generous emotions often overwhelmed his judgment. And in politics, although the most popular of stump orators, and never happier or more truly himself than in a political speech, in which, with the instinct of a born fighter, he drank delight of battle, yet he sometimes amazed and confounded his friends, who, however, could not doubt his sincerity nor question his purpose. The great cloud that fell upon his life seemed also to darken the country. The grief and consternation showed how strong a hold he had upon the national mind and heart, which indeed was never so firm as at the very moment that his good name seemed to be obscured. It was the most tremendous ordeal to which any public man of his peculiar character and quality of eminence has ever been exposed in this country. The most remarkable fact in it all was the way in which he endured it. The blacker the cloud appeared to be, the more sturdy was his stern defiance, and for weeks of seemingly accumulated and insurmountable obstruction, he faced unflinchingly a possible doom, the mere prospect of which might well have withered a brave heart conscious of innocence. That the cloud ever wholly disappeared cannot be said, in view of the tone of the press, even as he lay dead in his house. But that he could never have maintained his position as he did, if he had not been generally acquitted in the public mind, seems to be indisputable. If the relation of his later life to the country was somewhat changed, the result was due to the decline of confidence in what had been believed to be his strongest quality, supreme good sense and sound judgment, rather than to doubt of his moral integrity. No man lived more in the public eye and for the public than Mr. Beecher. In his speeches and sermons and writings, he took the public into his confidence with a freedom that was characteristic and natural in him, but which would have been extraordinary in any other man. He could not pass through the street without universal recognition, and no man in the two cities was so well known to everybody as he. At public meetings and at dinners where he was to speak, he came late amid smiling and expectant applause, and with the air of saying, "Where McGregor sits, there is the head of the table." He had the right to that air, for wherever he was to speak he was the chief orator. But he was no niggard of generous praise and sympathy, and no man spoke with more fervent eulogy and eloquent approval of other men. Doubtless, like an actor or singer, the long habit of receiving applause had made it pleasant to him. And is the fact with all extempore speaking, the greater the applause, the higher the eloquence of his strain. It is a reciprocal action. Of Mr. Beecher's later platform speeches, the most remarkable was his political address at the Brooklyn Rink in 1884, which was delivered amid a storm of enthusiasm, while in the delivery he was himself wrought to the highest feeling. His power over the emotions of an audience was unsurpassed in this country probably since Patrick Henry. Thomas Corwin and Sergeant Prentice perhaps were as great masters of humor and patriotic appeal upon the stump, but Beecher added to these a pathos and sentiment and poetic tone in which the others did not excel. He had not the fine, glittering, incisive touch of Wendell Phillips' fatal sarcasm and vituperation. Phillips stood quietly and played his polished rapier with a flexible wrist. but its point was deadly. Beecher smote and crushed. One was the deft Saladin, with his chaste and curving scimitar. The other was Richard, with his heavy battle axe. In the great controversy in which both were engaged upon the same side, indeed but under different banners and wearing different colors, Beecher and Phillips, amid a course of eloquence, were the two chief voices. Garrison was not distinctively an orator, while Phillips was the special and distinctive orator of the cause, and his fame as a public man belongs to that cause alone. But Beecher had many interests and relations, and his oratory had other strains. They were friends always, and Phillips spoke often in Plymouth Church, and uttered many a glowing word of his fellow laborer. When these words are published, the freshness of the impression of Beecher's death will have passed, and from every part of the country his eulogy will have been spoken. The universal emotion, the warmth and tenor of the tributes, will have shown how eminent a figure he was, and that his death is felt to be a national loss. One of the papers described him as the last of a great generation, and Senator Cullen, speaking of Logan in the crowded Brooklyn Academy on the evening of Beecher's death, called the roll of illustrious names, of which he was the latest, and among which it surely belongs. His profession was the preaching of peace and good will. But how often he must have felt that his Master came not to bring peace, but a sword. His buoyant temperament, his perfect health, his love of nature and of man, of children and flowers, of the changing sky and landscape, his abounding sympathy, his rich and sensitive humor, made his life joyous and often happy. But it was none the less a stormy life, ending at last, amid the sorrow of a country, in happy rest, and the good fame of a great orator for human welfare. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. The Golden Age. In this country we are inclined to believe that the epoch that followed the Revolution was one of the utmost purity and simplicity. But it was one of the Fathers who said to a friend upon the adjournment of the first Congress, "Do you suppose such a set of rascals will ever assemble again?" In his diary John Adams appeals to the calmer mind and juster judgment of the coming age, meaning that in which we live, and from which we look wistfully back to old John Adams's cocked hat and knee breeches as the symbols of a nobler time. Then there is Fisher Ames, one of the famous orators and conspicuous leaders of the beginning of the century, who, studying his country at the time to which we recur as the age of high purpose and lofty men, bewails the sordidness, selfishness, and degradation around him. Of course, he says, 70 years ago, the single passion that engrosses us, the only avenue to consideration and importance in our society, is the accumulation of property. Our inclinations cling to gold, and are bedded in it as deeply as that precious ore in the mine. As experience evinces that popularity, in other words, consideration and power, is to be procured by the meanest of mankind, the meanest in spirit and understanding, and in the worst of ways, it is obvious that at present the incitement to genius is next to nothing. We might suppose that we were listening to a contemporary cynic, and whoever reads the history of the politics of that time will find that the better days of the Republic were very like the days in which we deplore their disappearance. When Mr. Ames died, Mr. John Quincy Adams wrote a review of his works, in which, with the equanimity and moderation of the Golden Age, he remarks, "It is a melancholy contemplation of human nature to see a mind so highly cultivated and so richly gifted as that of Mr. Ames soured and exasperated into the very ravings of a bedlamite." He then proceeds to speak of those who, without believing Mr. Ames's absurd and inconsistent political creed, are selfishly eager for its propagation, being choice spirits amounting to at most 600 (their name was the Essex Junto), and who hold that the porcelain must rule over the earthenware, the blind and sordid multitude must put themselves bound hand and foot into the custody of the lynx-eyed, seraphic souls of the 600, and then all together must go and squat for protection under the 100 hands of the British Briareus. To this gentle strain Mr. John Lowell replied in a similar vein, beginning by speaking of the malignity of Mr. Adams's sarcasm, and of his following Mr. Ames to the grave with crocodile tears, informing him that he had no need to assail Mr. Ames's friends with all the venom of an infuriated partisan, because he had already obtained his reward for ratting from the Federalists, and this act of gratitude to his benefactors was unnecessary. Mr. Lowell ends his reply by saying that in the course of a short political life Mr. Adams had received more than $70,000 from the public, and that while no man pitied Mr. Ames, Mr. Adams is an object of sincere commiseration with many a man of high and honorable feelings, while it is to be doubted whether he is the object of envy to any man on earth. These are glimpses of the golden age, of that better day of the Republic with which our own is so often and so injuriously contrasted. Indeed, there is no finer cordial for despondency than a glance at the paradise that hovers behind our retreating steps. The mountain traveler turns and sees a lovely vision floating in the sky. How faintly flushed, how phantom fair, was Monte Rosa hanging there, 1,000 shadowy penciled valleys and snowy dells in a golden air. "Good lack," he cries, "are those the crags and precipices along which I slid and stumbled in terror of my life? The hanging gardens of the past, the halcyon epoch of our history, the lost paradise of our fathers, are all crags and precipices along which the race and our country have stumbled and slid? If any man is disposed to think that he has fallen upon evil times, let him open his history. It is a marvelous tonic." Does he think republics ungrateful? Look at Mr. Motley's vivid portrait of John of Barneveld. When he was 72 years old, he writes from his prison to his wife and family: "I receive at this moment the very heavy and sorrowful tidings that I, an old man, for all my services done well and faithfully to the fatherland for so many years, must prepare myself to die tomorrow." Does he think irreligion undermining society? Look into Smiles's Huguenots in France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. For attending Huguenot meetings, men were captured by soldiers and sentenced to the galleys, mostly for life. They were chained by the neck with murderers and other criminals, and were quartered in Paris in the dungeon of the Chateau de la Tournelle. Thick iron collars were attached by iron chains to the beams. The collar was closed around the prisoner's neck and riveted with blows of a hammer upon an anvil. 20 men in pairs were chained to each beam. They could not sleep lying, they could not sleep sitting or standing up straight, for the beam was too high for the one and too low for the other. This was done in the name of religion. The age of Louis XIV is called one of the great epochs of the world. It was an age in which the king's mistress persuaded him to slaughter and banish hundreds of thousands of his subjects because of their religious faith, and the great preachers of his church applauded, and the Holy Father approved, and even Madame de Sévigné, whose letters some young ladies at Newport and Saratoga are diligently reading and sighing for the good old witty times in which she lived, wrote of the most innocent and most devoted men. Hanging is quite a refreshment to me. They have just taken 24 or 30 of these men and are going to throw them off. The golden age is not yesterday or tomorrow, but today. It is the age in which we live, not that in which somebody else lived. The trouble, vexation, corruption, weakness, selfishness, meanness, which dismay us and tempt us to despair, are the old lions that have always beset the path. No man is born out of time, and what man living to-day who is not pinched with poverty or disease would have lived 1,000 years ago? If our politics seem mean and our men small, how does Alfred's time seem, or the glory of Athens, or the court of Louis XIV, or Luther's Germany? What did Jefferson think of Hamilton, or the Aurora say of Washington? End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 from Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. From Easy Chair, Volume 2 by George William Curtis. Chapter 16. Spring Pictures. On a late, beautiful spring afternoon, the Easy Chair rolled itself into the suburbs for a stroll. There were everywhere the signs of the advance of a great city and the pathetic forlornness of the municipal frontier. Pleasant country houses, spacious, rambling, with broad piazzas and gardens and lawns, had been apparently suddenly overtaken by streets and stone sidewalks and lamps. There were the rattle and shriek of the incessant railway trains nearby. Tall factory chimneys smoked, and machinery rammed, and steam whistles blew all around the quiet old houses. The contrast gave them a kind of conscious life. They seemed to be aware of the incongruity of their character with the new neighborhood. They had a helpless air, as if nothing remained but submission to division into regular building lots, and the absolute extinction of rural seclusion and charm. There was the impression of a faint and futile struggle between city and country, in which, indeed, for a moment, the excellence of each was lost, but the result of which was not doubtful. As the Easy Chair pushed on, it saw in fancy the old pastoral peace and retirement of the places when they were indeed in the country. It recalled the noted men of the older day, who sought here relaxation and repose. There was the placid river, on which no restless steamer foamed, but only silent sloops drifted or careened. Yonder were the leaf coves under the wooded and rocky banks, from which the Indian had but recently paddled his canoe. No railroad harmed the virgin shyness of the shore. It was El Dorado, Arcadia, the land of Goshen. It was the home of peace, of plenty, of content. Such a poet, such a painter, is idealizing memory on a spring afternoon in the suburbs. It seemed so gross, so wrong, the sidewalk and gas lamps and factory chimneys and steam whistles should invade and devastate the tranquil fields, that indignant imagination filled them as fact with all fancies and tranquil fields suggest. Doubtless in the closets of those quiet houses there were the bones of plenty of old skeletons. Those spacious, sunny rooms were the scenes of the familiar domestic tragedies, against which not the most romantic of country houses can shut the door. Up those steps have swayed and hesitated the doubtful feet of the oldest son, heir of precious hopes, the child of fervent prayers, hesitating and lingering at hours long past midnight, watched for and waited for by the mother's heart that breaks but does not falter. In that broad hall, on the brightest of May mornings, the daughter of the house has stood, radiant as the day, and crowned with orange blossoms. There have met the hopes and joys of youth, the tears and blessings and farewells of older years. The pretty pageant filled the house and faded slowly and utterly away. The old house has known too the solemn shadow that falls on every house. It seems to regretful memory the abode of unchanging delight. But from that door the slow procession moved, and those whose hospitable smile and word had hallowed every room returned no more. They are gone, the bride, the parent, the friend, they are all gone, the old familiar faces, the age, the society, the politics, the interests, they are all gone. Why should not the house go too? It was early spring, and the easy chair, looking up, saw half a dozen kites flying in the air. A little further, and laughing girls were skipping rope. Boys were spinning peg tops and playing marbles and driving hoops. The boys and girls who lived in the quiet old country house did the same 100 years ago. They flew kites and drove hoops, and that little bride skipped rope and carried dolls. The age, the society, the politics, the interests were very different. They are indeed all changed. But tops are changeless, marbles are immortal, and so are boys and girls. They know nothing of the old house over which easy chair becomes pensive. They belong to the new time which demands its demolition. Recording by Brianna.
Chapter 17 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Chapter 17. Proper and Improper. Longfellow has commemorated in a beautiful sonnet the delightful evenings of Mrs. Kimball's readings, and certainly it was a singular pleasure to see and to hear her. Her historic name associated her with her Uncle John and her Aunt Mrs. Siddons, and she had always the port of one conscious of a famous lineage. She used to say, with a half-humorous, half-proud emphasis, that she belonged to Her Majesty's Players, and in her presence it was easy to believe that Her Majesty's Players were an important body in the state. Her power of identification with the various characters in the plays, and the skill with which she maintained the individuality throughout, were always remarkable, and the symmetry and completeness of the whole performance left nothing to be criticized. The only observation that suggested itself might be that the stage traditions were evident in her rendering, but that in turn only suggested the further question whether the traditions were not worthy of respect. Dramatic and histrionic forms of art, like all others, are but representations of nature under certain conditions and limitations. They are not an imitation, a facsimile, and every man will be at odds with any work of art in any kind who does not bear this in mind. The spectator complains of unnaturalness upon the stage. The substance of his feeling is that people do not talk and act so in ordinary life. That is true. But if the theatre should show us men and women doing upon the stage what they do in ordinary life, the theatre would be no more attractive than the street or the parlor. It is not the spectacle of ordinary life that we expect to see in the theatre. It is a view of human life and nature under ideal conditions, and it is as irrelevant to require that the player shall seem to us like the man with whom we have been transacting business, as that he should speak plain prose instead of blank verse. If Mrs. Kimball had read the words of Rosalind, or of Portia, of Shylock or Mercutio, as if they were neighbors of hers and people whom we were in the habit of meeting, the effect would have been ludicrous. When she came in, the Fanny Kimball of Talford and of the wild enthusiasm of the grandfathers of today ripened into the comely and queenly woman, and seated herself at the little table on which the great volume lay open, she was the magician who was open to us in the realm of faerie, the world of imagination, not to take us back into the familiar scenes of the world of New York or Chicago. The spell was resistless. The deep, rich, melodious voice flowed out like an enchanted singing river, along which we glided seeing visions and dreaming dreams. To sit and listen to her was like sitting and watching Titian laying on the canvas the gorgeous tints which before our eyes took on the forms of men and angels. A rarer, a more refined delight which of us has known? Did it ever occur to us that Mrs. Kemble was doing anything improper, anything unwomanly? In the wonderful picture of Portia that her voice's music drew, was there anything a little repulsive, a little unfeminine? This question was suggested to the Easy Chair by the remark of one of the most devoted and delighted of all the listeners at those readings, that he was very sorry to see that the University of London had decided to admit women to all its degrees upon precisely equal terms with men. The secret reason of the regret, of course, is the feeling that there would be something unwomanly in the act of competing for a degree which would open the pursuit of professions, especially the medical profession, which are usually and often exclusively cultivated by men. Yet when pressed, the Easy Chair's interlocutor admitted that there was nothing more essentially unfeminine in the practice of medicine by a woman than in the recitation of Shakespeare for the entertainment of a miscellaneous crowd. It is a question of habit, not of instinct, nor of principle, nor of reason. When the old Greek and Oriental idea of absolute seclusion and subordination is abandoned, a woman's reading from Shakespeare for the pleasure of the public is an action not different in kind from her practicing medicine, or serving on a school committee. This generation, however, is more used to the one than to the other. It is a habit, nothing more. Charles Lamb regrets in one of his later essays that we have no rationale of sauces, or theory of mixed flavors, as to show why cabbage is reprehensible with roast beef, laudable with bacon, why the haunch of mutton seeks the alliance of currant jelly, the shoulder civilly declineth it, why loin of veal, a pretty problem, being itself unctuous, seeketh the adventitious lubricity of melted butter, and why the same part in pork, not more oleaginous, abhorreth from it, why oysters in death rise up against the contamination of brown sugar, while they are posthumously amorous of vinegar, why the sour mango and the sweet jam by turns court and are accepted by the compliable mutton hash, she not yet decidedly declaring for either. We are as yet but in the empirical stage of cookery. It is not in cookery alone that this mystery is still unsolved. Why, for instance, should it seem a womanly use of heaven's gift that Jenny Lind should sing for the pleasure of 1,000 men, and something strange and unfeminine that Portia should plead with eloquence in a court to save a hapless woman from prison or the cord? Why is it fitting that Mrs. Kemble should professionally read Shakespeare, and queer that she should professionally attend women in peril and sickness? Do we not naturally and logically glide into the part of the citation from Lamb that we just now omitted? Why salmon, a strong sapor per se, fortifieth its condition with the mighty lobster sauce, whose embraces are fatal to the delicater relish of the turbot? Must we not say that we are as yet but in the rudimentary knowledge of what is and is not feminine? When the example of the London University is not singular, but when all opportunities are opened equally to all talent and vocation, when it is not forbidden a woman to do any honorable work for which she is by nature and by study and training properly equipped, unless the laws of nature fail, will any greater catastrophe befall, will there be any more signal reversion of the order of things, than if cabbage should come at last to be eaten with roast beef, and currant jelly cement an alliance with the mutton shoulder? End of section 17. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 18 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Belinda and the Vulgar. It is perhaps because the Easy Chair sometimes discusses questions of behavior that it is occasionally asked to express an opinion upon more difficult social points. Thus it was lately requested to say whether it did not think that the great want of our society is a social standard. The inquiry was made by the lovely Belinda, who was charmingly dressed for a select party, and the Easy Chair was obliged to own that it did not at once comprehend the scope of the inquiry, and to seek an explanation. As Belinda proceeded to elucidate her meaning, it seemed to be tolerably plain that she was contemplating some kind of rank, or visible and recognized distinction, which should separate society from what is not society, and it was impossible not to feel that however high the dividing line, and however small the circle which it enclosed, she was herself included within it. The Easy Chair thereupon described to her a conversation which it held long ago with a distinguished man upon English social life and the advantages of an aristocracy. The distinguished man's views were very much like those which are set forth in Disraeli's Sibyl and Coningsby, and which were known 40 years ago as those of Young England. They proposed a national life blended of feudal romance and modern philanthropy. There was to be a gracious nobility of very blue blood, which had been clarified in the veins of the Plantagenets, who were to live in stately castles in the midst of superb demesnes, and to be exceedingly good to their tenants and retainers, for whom there were to be maypoles and flitches of bacon at Christmas, and greased poles to climb at appropriate times, and sacks to run races in, and who were to be visited at their neat little cottages, when they were ill, by the ladies from the castle, and who were to be industrious and obedient and humble and grateful, and above all things to know their place. The nobility were to own the land and govern the country and live in splendid idleness, and the happy peasantry were to do all the work and bow respectfully when the nobility passed by, and go to bed when the curfew tolled, and to make no trouble. This was the Young England programme, and the Arcadia of the Disraeli novel, and this also showed its familiar features in the talk of the distinguished man as he bewailed the social bareness of American life and descanted upon the charm of an ancient and well-ordered society. But when the Easy Chair mischievously asked him whether he did not think that he might tire of the greased pole, and the dance upon the lawn, and the gracious patronage, and the respectful gratitude, the amusing bewilderment of the distinguished man showed that in his admiration of the society that he described, he assumed always that he was to belong to the class that lived in the stately castles and benignly condescended to the humble cottagers. His view, therefore, was very simple. It was merely that he should like to live in splendid idleness, steeped in luxury, and surrounded by respectful servants. Belinda listened to this story, of which the Easy Chair made no application, with a slight blush, and to the polite inquiry what kind of social standards she contemplated, she responded that she meant a certain fixed line which should exclude the vulgar. But she was immediately silent, as if reflecting upon a difficult proposition, and did not answer when she was asked what she thought would be the consequence of removing the vulgar from the circles which she considered most select. Her benevolent attention invited further question, especially as at the same moment a lady entered the room, who bore one of the most noted family names in the country, and most familiar in fashionable annals, a family which delights to trace its lineage to a royal source. This proud dame had married her daughter as if by main force to a coroneted lord of hereditary acres. It was a familiar fact of the society in which she was a conspicuous figure, and it was impossible not to ask, can there be anything more coarsely vulgar than to sell a daughter for money and a title to a man for whom she does not care, and shall we begin to erect the social standard by expelling the vulgar offender? Belinda was still silent, and the brilliant rooms began to fill and murmur with a gay company. Among them came the loud and diamonded Mrs. Smasher, to whose unparalleled fêtes even Belinda would be almost willing to request a card. The Smasher lineage is not renowned or regal. The Smasher mind is imperfectly educated. The Smasher manners are those of the suddenly rich who are not also suddenly refined. Is any conceivable vulgarity greater than the Smasher vulgarity? Oh, Belinda, And shall we continue these exercises by expelling also this essentially vulgar person?" Belinda was still silent. She has remained silent even to this day. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 from the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. From Easy Chair, Volume 2 by George William Curtis, Chapter 19, Decayed Gentility. Decayed gentility has great interest for the novel reader, and the man and woman who have seen better days are familiar figures in actual life. Hampton Court is regarded by some travellers with pensive regard as a kind of almshouse for this class of the indigent, and institutions nearer home are described with a deferential courtesy and avoidance as homes for decayed gentlewomen. It cannot be pleasant to the persons themselves to be so described, but the founders of such places have perhaps a comfortable sense of reflected honour, as if the impulse to provide a retreat of the kind were of itself a sign of very gentility. Despite the plaintive little plea which the description itself urges for this decayed class of our fellow beings, the people who have seen better days are not generally an engaging multitude. A person whose chief distinction is that he was once more prosperous than he is now seems to renounce any present claim upon consideration, and to offer his inability as a ground of regard. It is an appeal to pity, but pity of old has a disagreeable relative. The pathos of the appeal lies first in the sense of contrast, and then in the spiritual rather than the material poverty which it discloses. The lady who lets lodgings, and whose air the allusions of whose conversation constantly suggest that she has seen better days, is a person who is mastered by circumstances, and therefore does not compel respect. But a woman who is the perfectly self-respecting lady fulfills simply the duty of the moment with no conscious appeal for sympathy, and if by chance you discover that she has been more prosperous, the fact that she has not the conceit of it strengthens your regard. For it is no personal credit to have been more prosperous. As your landlady shows you the convenience of the room, she lets fall that her father the bishop, or her uncle the senator, or her lamented cousin the millionaire would be deeply grieved if he could know that his kinswoman was actually letting lodgings. Then, madam, you have seen better days? Ah, sir! But how is it personally creditable to the good woman that her uncle was honourable and her cousin rich? She recalls the circumstances of others at the expense of her own character. The lodger wishes to hire rooms upon their own merits. He resents the bribery of pity to take them. If they are a little stuffy, they certainly seem no airier because his landlady once sat upon a crimson sofa and read novels all day long. If some philanthropist builds a retreat to which she can retire gratis, and pass her declining years in regretful recollection of the crimson sofa, so let it be. Such a retreat may be dedicated to sentimental repining. But a woman of spirit and character never becomes a decayed gentlewoman, however destitute she may be. This refusal to succumb to circumstances and to make the best of it, which is all that can be asked, is charmingly sketched in Lamb's Captain Jackson. The captain's frugal table had the air of a feast, such was the magic of his cheerfulness. His plain cheese was served like Stilton or Roquefort, and slipping a shred of it upon his guest's plate, he contented himself with the rind, gaily declaring that the nearer the bone, the sweeter the meat. Poverty was no pleasanter to him than to the rest of us, but had he gone to the almshouse he would not have complained, and in no word or sigh of his would you have discovered that he had seen better days. The family of Captain Jackson is by no means extinct. The other day the Easy Chair met one of them in Broadway, an elderly gentleman in a well-brushed, exceedingly threadbare suit, moving briskly along the pavement. His greeting was alert and courteous. There was a little chat of the day's news, a gay jest or two, and then good morning. Half a century ago this was a young man about town, the heir of a fortune, the youth of a family, who dressed and drove and dined and danced like the golden youth of to-day. When the first Italian opera troupe came, he was nightly behind the scenes. In the circle of Knickerbocker wits he was one. He wrote verses and had a kind of literary name. His portrait was published in a weekly paper. He sat at the good tables. His name was Fortunio. Everything is gone but a cheerful spirit. Nobody knows exactly how he lives, but only that it is in extreme poverty. But he preserves the tone of prosperity. He writes notes in a beautiful and graceful hand upon the cheap paper. You remember our conversation the other morning about Anstey's Bath Guide, and if you will look in your Fraser for this month, you will find that I was right. Here is the assumption that every gentleman takes Fraser, and that your correspondent may have dipped into his before you have looked at yours. Doubtless he had seen it at some reading-room, perhaps, or on the Britannia's counter. One day we had spoken of a famous author. A little while afterwards came a comely package containing an old and choice work of his, and a note. Dear Easy Chair, I thought it might be a pleasure to you to own this rather uncommon copy of an author whom you evidently admire, and which is a pleasure to my shelves to spare. What a fine air of elegant leisure in a library! But the shelves were a few remnant books, probably worthless to sell, but affording the friendly soul true satisfaction in giving. Fortunio is not a decayed gentleman. His gentility, in the best sense, is in full vigour. Everything but that, indeed, is decayed, but there is no unmanly moping about better days, although in few men's lives could there be a sharper contrast between the past and the present. This cheerful steadiness is largely due to temperament, but it is not therefore beyond those who have not the same temperament. Character can emulate it. It's bad enough to be poor, said one of the Captain Jackson family, but it's a great deal worse to be sulky too. It is very easy, indeed, for prosperity to preach resignation to adversity, and to urge it to bear up bravely. But it is a true gospel, although it be easy to preach. Pure Lacrima Christi is as precious when poured from a glass of Murano as from a pewter mug. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 from the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. From Easy Chair, Volume 2 by George William Curtis, Chapter 20. The Pharisee. There is no more beautiful and impressive passage in the New Testament than that which contrasts the Pharisee thanking God that he is not as other men are, and the publican who asks mercy as a sinner. But there is no passage also which has been more ingeniously perverted and is exceedingly amusing to hear. Jeremy Diddle or Robert Macker or Dick Turpin railing at honest and industrious men as Pharisees because they prefer honesty and industry to knavery. The taste for honesty and sobriety seems natural and simple enough, and the qualities themselves quite as valuable as those of Diddle or even Jonathan Wild the Great. But Jonathan will have none of them. They are Pharisaic impertinences. They are impracticable and visionary speculations, which assume heaven while yet we stand upon the green earth. And Mr. Wilde, who assures us that he does not desire to pass himself off as better than other men, declares with the noble candour which distinguishes him that simple, downright dishonest is good enough for him. He does not indeed choose that precise word, but he conveys that precise idea. It's a good trick, and it is generally sure of applause. But it is only another version of a familiar maxim that when you have no argument, you must abuse of plaintiff's attorney. As a matter of fact, your client did steal the handkerchief, or forge the name, or fire the barn. But I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, you may well say, and I appeal to all good citizens, is not this ostentation of superior virtue, this fine air of moral indignation toward my client, simply because he happened to slip his hand into the wrong pocket, a little suspicious? Are we angels? I ask your honour, in this word-a-day world, the celestial seat and the mount of vision, and is a man so very much better than his fellows merely because he rolls up his sanctimonious eyes with the Pharisee and thanks God that he is holier than other men? Nay, gentlemen, have we not in the sublime and immortal parable a divine warning against this Pharisaism which denounces the slides and slips of our common frail humanity? I ask you, gentlemen, by your verdict not to place a premium upon that most odious and repulsive arrogancies, Pharisaism, but it is upon the political platform that jibes and sneers at Pharisaism are intended to be most stinging. The Honourable Jonathan Wild the Great comes out strong, as his henchmen truly declare against his political opponents. With one vast, comprehensive sneer, he brands them as Pharisees, as if he were snorting consuming fire. It is not surprising, because they have had their eye upon Jonathan. They have seen him in bad company. They have caught him conveying public treasure. They know all about him, and he knows they know all about him. He called himself Tweed, and he made a mesh of statutes to legalize robbery. But how good he was to the poor! how he distributed coal to the chilly, how he planted pinks and daisies in the City Hall Park and made the Battery to bloom as the rose, how he received wedding gifts for his daughter from our best citizens, and how generously they subscribed to erect his statue to commemorate that bright flower of the state. And now a sneaking, mousing gang of would-be archangels prate about common honesty and demand that public hands shall be clean hands. Fellow citizens, Jonathan Wild is a man of the people. He doesn't pretend to be higher and purer and better than other men. He didn't graduate at college. Indeed, he never read the Iliad in the original Greek. No, fellow citizens, there is no cambric handkerchief and eau de cologne about him. He's just one of the boys. He whoops it up with the plain people, and thank God, whatever he is not a Pharisee. The argument is ingenious. It does not deny that he is a thief. It only insists that those who assert it are Pharisees, and Pharisees are so odious that it is much better to scoff at them than to punish Mr. Wilde. There was a good old countryman who had been early taught to take men as they are, which means to consider them liars and rascals. One day a neighbor remarked to him that he thought that the old man had lost the money with which he bought voters, because he said, "While they take your money, the other side take their votes." "The deuce they do," said the old countryman. "Yes," said the other, "and you will find in the long run that political honesty is the best political policy." "You think so, do you?" was the reply. "Well, do you know that you're a blanked metaphysical Pharisee?" It is obvious that when the advocacy of common honesty in any relation of life is savagely and scornfully decried as Phariseeism, it is because somebody's withers and wrong. It is a plea of guilty. It is the cry of Squeers when the picture of Dotheboys Hall was displayed to the world. "I didn't do it." If a man demands honesty in politics, and it is retorted, "You are a Pharisee," it is because the dishonesty cannot be denied or disproved, and the retort is therefore a summons to all honest men to look out for thieves. To deride the demand for decency is to concede that anything but indecency is impracticable. If it be only Pharisees who insist that sugar shall not be sanded, that milk shall not be swill-fed, that coffee shall not be chicory, that nutmegs shall not be wood, that cloth shall not be shoddy, that employees of the government shall not be forced to pay for their places, that public officers shall be honest, and that government shall not be venal, it is pleasant to think how many intelligent, upright, industrious, and practical Americans are Pharisaical. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Chapter 21. Lady Mavourneen on her Travels. The passenger in the crowded street railway car is often disturbed by the conscious absorption of his masculine neighbors in their newspapers when a woman enters and looks for a seat. If she be young and pretty, there are apparently seats enough, however great the crowd, and even if a man is slow to rise, he may yet, with Mr. Ready-wit, exhort his son sitting upon his knee to get up and give the lady his seat. The impatient passenger, in his indignation at the want of courtesy upon the part of others, sometimes forgets, indeed, to rise himself. But there is always some Nathan comfortably seated farther away, whose amused look says to the impatient but stationary David, "Thou art the man." It would be very unfair to generalize from this frequent situation that the American is uncourteous. On the contrary, he is the most truly polite man among men of all nations. Lady Mavourneen, who is familiar with the society and the manners of many countries, and who has been always accustomed to hear Americans in Europe described everywhere and with pungent emphasis as "those Americans," was amazed upon coming here to find universal courtesy. "In the street or at the railway station," she said, "if I ask anybody any question, I receive the most prompt and polite reply. Everybody is at my service, not with much bowing or flourishing, but heartily and honestly. I have never seen such universal courtesy." When she was asked whether she had observed the absorption of the streetcar passengers in their newspapers, she smiled and said that she had never been obliged to stand, because someone was sure to rise. But in Paris, she said that often as she was passing to a seat, Monsieur Crapaud, raising his hat politely and saying warmly "Pardon," pressed by and secured the seat. Lady Mavourneen, who tells a little story with great humour, described a scene in a crowded church in Paris. An apparent lady was disturbing everybody by pushing along toward a distant chair in the row, when Lady Mavourneen arose to allow her to pass more easily, and the apparent lady immediately slipped into my lady's chair and held it fast, saying only in reply to her earnest remonstrance, "Madame, you left the chair, I took it, you have lost it, voilà." A vagabond of this kind took the seat of a gentleman who had risen to help a lady off a street car. When the gentleman returned he mentioned to the interloper that it was his seat. The interloper shrugged his shoulders, remarked that it was an empty seat when he took it, and that he should continue to occupy it. "If you don't get out of that seat, I'll take you out," was the rejoinder of the gentleman, whose shoulders were broad. The squatter scowled and abdicated. Lady Mavourneen found, what every lady will find, that she could travel everywhere in the States alone, with entire safety, and surrounded by the utmost courtesy. The word "lady," with which she will be accosted by hackmen and porters and conductors, is spoken with kindly respect. And even if some person in a lady's garb thrusts herself into the queue of passengers, slowly advancing to the window of the ticket office to buy tickets, there may be sour looks and amazed stares, but she will generally have her way. So great is our courtesy that we honor the counterfeit claim. The source of the most serious objection to the demand of suffrage for women is the secret apprehension that men will lose their sincere deference, and treat women as they treat other men, thus robbing life of the tender romance of chivalric courtesy. Emerson says of the successful lover and his mistress, "She was in heaven while he pursued her as a star. Can she be heaven if she stoops to such an one as he?" Yet while this feeling is frequent, and seems to many very plausible, it is the true respect of the American for women which is the real strength of this very movement. The European sentiment for woman is still somewhat medieval. She is still the goddess of the troubadours and the minne singers, but a goddess who is treated as the South Sea Islanders treat their gods, beating them when they are not propitious. To the American she is Wordsworth's "phantom of delight," seen upon nearer view, and it is idle to prattle about her sphere as if she did not instinctively know it more truly than men. The universal courtesy which Lady Mavourneen remarked is essential respect and kindliness of feeling, which no more permits a man to gild his selfishness with a pardon and a touching of his hat than it permits him to strike a woman. Yet although courtesy is essentially in the heart, and is kind feeling rather than respectful manner, it is not worth while to despise the manner. If we must choose between the good heart and suavity of address between Boythorn and Lovelace, of course we shall choose Boythorn. But why not both? Why not the mens sana in corpore sano? In The Iron Pen, Longfellow says, "And in words not idle and vain, I shall answer and thank you again, for the gift and the grace of the gift, O beautiful Helen of Maine." It is not only the gift, it is the grace in giving which completes the charm. The young American of today puffs his cigarette in the face of his partner on the balcony, in the boat, or in the wagon, and smiles at the frilled Lothario of yesterday, bowing in his flowered coat and paying stately compliments as stiff as her brocade to the dame whom he addresses. The youth is right in saying that the flowered coat and the stately compliment were the dress and the speech of an old sinner. But he would be right also if he remembered that familiarity breeds contempt, and that he may wisely distrust his feeling for any woman who does not put him upon his good behaviour. The courtesy which Lady Mavourneen observed in the railway station and in the street was plain, but it was genuine. Respect naturally produces courtesy. Good manners are the cultivation of natural courtesy, the gift and the grace of the gift. This was the chief remembrance, and it was a unique and precious treasure which Lady Mavourneen carried back to Europe from America. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 from the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. From Easy Chair, Volume 2 by George William Curtis, Chapter 22, General Sherman. None of his great contemporaries was universally beloved more than General Sherman, perhaps none so much. The rare happiness was his not only of becoming famous by taking a great part in a great historic achievement, but of the complete enjoyment of fame. His later years forecast the future. He saw not only that his name would be remembered, but remembered with personal affection. Very few men have been able to foresee this, and very few more clearly than Sherman. It is due not to achievement alone, but to personal quality blended with achievement. In his last years he was wholly withdrawn from public affairs, and with extraordinary tact, although constantly in the public eye and mind, and although the sense of his historic personality, so to speak, was constant, he refrained from declarations upon pending public questions, and the remarks of his interviews were not devoted to subjects of general controversy. This was doubtless the result of his accurate apprehension of his relation to the country. He had been educated by it, and had served it as a soldier. He had strong convictions, and was frank of speech, but he belonged to all. He could not well be a common partisan. He was apparently untouched by political ambition. If he had felt its spur at all, he was happily able to prefer the general, permanent, affectionate popular regard to the fierce enthusiasm of a political campaign and the passionate ardour of partisanship. Whatever the reason, he held aloof. Perhaps at one moment, had he assented, his name might have been caught up in a vast and tumultuous political convention, and to a burning and skilful appeal to patriotism and the still glowing memories of the war, a palpitating party might have responded and made him its leader. But if others doubted and hesitated, he did not. He knew himself, and he refused. The opportunity for which the most illustrious and the most famous of Americans have longed and labored and pined and offered itself to him, unsought, unwished, he smiled it away. Among the chief figures of the epoch of the war, probably Lincoln and Sherman were the most individual and original. The most romantic and picturesque of the many renowned events of that time was the march to the sea. It has already a distinctive character, like that of the Greeks in Xenophon's story of the 10,000. When the news of its successful issue reached this part of the country, it served to show the simple and honest patriotism of one of the more unfortunate of the Union generals. Burnside, after the explosion of the mine at Petersburg, had been relieved, and was staying with a company of friends at a country house on Narragansett Bay. The company were still sitting one morning upon the spacious piazza, when a messenger rode up and announced Sherman's success. Burnside's delight was enthusiastic. All thought of himself vanished. The good cause only was in his mind and heart, and running to his wife he joyfully kissed her, saying, "I know that the company feels as I do, and will forgive me." It was the feeling of a soldier, as simple and true-hearted and patriotic, but not so fortunate as Sherman. It was the same candor and manly sweetness of nature that softened Sherman's voice whenever he spoke of the soldiers of the war to whom fate had seemed to be unkind. He is gone, the last of the old familiar figures, some of his old foes bearing him tenderly to the grave. Are not Lincoln, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Porter, Seward, Chase, Stanton, Sumner, and their fellow historic figures worth to rank with the elder revolutionary group dear to all Americans?
Chapter 23 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. The American Girl. A pleasing and constant topic of English writers is the American girl. One of the later commentators says of her, "American girls have shown they can receive, travel, and live without chaperones, escorts, or husbands, and are fast developing a bright, clear, intelligent, self-reliant, courageous, and refreshing variety of the human race." And again, "Even if in future years the slender Yankee belle is hidden behind the ampler beauty of the English matron, we may still hear from her lips the wit and shrewdness, the acute accent, the intelligent question, and the rapid repartee that proclaim her original nationality." The society pictures in the papers and magazines represent the dismay of the British matron with the marriageable daughters as she surveys the avatar of the American divinity and rival. The essential differences of society in the two countries are at once suggested, and the alarm of the watchful parent is justified. The charm of Miss Austen's novels is their acknowledged fidelity of portraiture of the society with which they deal. They are miniatures, but the likeness is wrought with exquisite skill of detail, and as the American reader reflects, he perceives that the great object of the game which they describe is eligible marriage. Indeed, the motive of the novel in general is love and marriage. We open the book, we are at once introduced to Paul, and presently to Virginia, and we proceed over the pages until we hear the approaching beat of the wedding march, which in fact we have heard from the first page, and we know that the end is at hand. But in the English novel of society, although the theme be marriage, it is not necessarily love. If that were essential, a host of rival fair ones with golden locks would bring no pang to the maternal bosom, because she would know that love will find out the one among the thousand. The passages that we have quoted apparently describe by contrast, which is a fact which does not seem to have occurred to the writer. Doubtless at heart he is loyal to the English girl, and does not admit even in debate that her supremacy of maidenhood can be disputed. When he says that American girls have shown that they can receive, travel, and live without chaperones, escorts, or husbands, he seems to mean that they have shown this distinctively as compared with other girls. When he adds that they are fast developing a bright, clear, intelligent, self-reliant, courageous, and refreshing variety of the human race, can he mean that those words describe a new variety of girl, and that it is not perfectly familiar in England? So in the other passage, when supposing the American girl transformed into the British matron, he remarks, with evident admiration, "We may still hear from her lips the wit and shrewdness, the acute accent, the intelligent question, and the rapid repartee that proclaim her original nationality." Would he have us understand that these are not the characteristics of the British matron of today? Or does he intimate only that the coming of the Americans will but enlarge the number of these delightful ladies? The writer certainly seems to describe by contrast, but he has wisely left a little cloud in which to envelop his retreat in case of emergency. Certainly we need not press him. Whatever he may think or say of the English girl, he has spoken well and truly of her American sister. His description applies to the girl who grows up amid the average conditions of American life, the girl who is portrayed in her more jejune condition in Henry James' Daisy Miller. The two chief qualities of that young woman, as represented by the shrewd and subtle artist, are self-respect and self-reliance. The perplexity of the phenomenon to the foreign reader lies in the fact that she does what the European girl without self-respect does. A distinguished writer in New York, no longer living, once said to the Easy Chair with an air of consternation, "Do you know that the best girls in New York go without escort to the matinees at the Academy? Goodness knows what will be the end of it." The good man was seriously troubled. He seemed to apprehend that the young woman who could go to a matinee without an escort would probably run off with a circus troupe, and presently ride, in a very short skirt, bare-backed horses in the ring. He evidently felt that the young women whom he had seen were in grave danger of losing maidenly reserve, and that their conduct betrayed a want of refinement of feeling. The secret of his alarm lay in the fact that the social conventions of foreign society had acquired in his mind the force of rules of morality. He shared the feelings of the delightful lady, who remarked that in her opinion it was immodest to go abroad without gloves. Nothing is more common than this confusion of mind, and one of the advantages of genuinely American society is that it dissipates such illusions. The Lady Mavourneen, who was familiar with the finest society both in France and England, said that the respect shown to women in this country was so sincere and universal that she should not hesitate to cross the continent alone. Why then should the Easy Chair's friend have been troubled that young women went unattended to the concert at the Academy? Every man there would have been their instant defender against insult. But they went, and they were allowed to go, because the insult was more improbable than fire, while the defense was sure. In what is called distinctively society in large cities, there is a great deal of feeling evinced by the observer at the Academy. There is abundant regard for misplaced conventions. Young women in Vienna and Paris who go unattended are generally working women or another class. And as working women are not respected by Lovelace and Lothario, they are exposed to insult. To avoid the chance of insult, therefore, a young woman must have an escort in a partially civilized city like Paris or Vienna. But no presumption lies against any woman in America. Her self-respect and self-reliance are unquestioned, and American women, old and young, are perpetually passing in railway trains by day and night from one part of the country to another, unsuspected and unsuspecting. In a country where social classes are not permanent or rigidly defined, as hitherto in America they have not been, the daughter as well as the son of the house contemplates the possibility of self-support. In such a country, the harem view of the sphere and occupation of women, however modified, wholly disappears. The word obey gradually vanishes from the marriage service or is smoothed away by interpretation. The ideal of woman changes, and as we think in America, improves. All the excellent qualities which the London writer attributes to the American girl spring from this change, from social conditions which foster self-respect and self-reliance, the demand of the suffrage, the rise of the woman's college, the challenge to the great universities to lift up their gates that women may come in, show no decline of the feminine ideal of woman, but its transformation from the fancy of a goddess or a toy into the old scriptural conception of the helpmeet. The British matron, as she scrutinizes what she may hold to be an invader of her realm, will not find that in any feminine quality or grace, even to the most exquisite taste in dress, or delicate charm of manner, or essential refinement of mind. Pocahontas defers to Boadicea, where the American imitates the English or any other, as when the English girl affects the French. She must suffer from the inevitable inferiority of all imitation. When her self-reliance is boisterous or without tact and fine perception, Daisy Miller will be as crude and distasteful as Lady Clara Vere de Vere is heartless and cruel. But Rosalind and Viola and Beatrice, and Tennyson's Eleanor and Adeline and Margaret, meet in the American a sister of the same lineage as their own, bred in an atmosphere most fortunate and fair. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 from the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Chapter 24. Annus Mirabilis. This year, the centenary of the opening of our national constitutional epoch, will be a Washington year. As on a saint's day there is a special service in his honor, so through all this year there will be a special remembrance of Washington and natural self-congratulation that in him we have a glory beyond that of other nations. The last striking tribute to him is also most timely, for it is that of Mr. Bryce in his American Commonwealth, whose publication happily coincided with the opening of this Annus Mirabilis. He says in speaking of Hamilton's death, "One cannot note the disappearance of this brilliant figure, to Europeans the most interesting in the earlier history of the Republic, without the remark that his countrymen seem to have never, either in his lifetime or afterward, duly recognized his splendid gifts." The explanation of this seeming want of appreciation is, however, very characteristic, for it lies in the instinctive American regard for morality. Mr. Bryce touches it when he proceeds. Washington, indeed, is a far more perfect character. Washington stands alone and unapproachable, like a snow peak rising above its fellows into the clear air of morning. with a dignity, constancy, and purity which have made him the ideal type of civic virtue to succeeding generations. No greater benefit could have befallen the Republic than to have such a type set from the first before the eye and mind of the people. That benefit is incalculable, and it will be acknowledged with every form of stately ceremonial and of eloquent enthusiasm during this year. The great event of 1789 was Washington's inauguration as President, and it is the most important event in the annals of the city. The cosmopolitan character of the city from its settlement and in the early time of the little town, when it was said that more than a dozen different languages were spoken in its streets, down to the present, when it is the third or fourth city in size upon the globe, has always checked the sentiment of local pride which is so great a force in the development of a community. Among all the original states, New York has seemed to care least for its significant events and its great men. That the Revolution was tactically largely a contest for the control of the Hudson, that the contest culminated at Saratoga, and that the new national order which resulted from the Revolution began in the city of New York, are facts which are known indeed, but which have not grown into a proud tradition universally cherished and constantly repeated and celebrated like similar great events in New England. This year, however, the last event, Washington's inauguration, will be the occasion of a great national observance. The President and Cabinet, senators and representatives and judges, distinguished delegates from every state will attend, and there will be religious and oratorical exercises and civil and military display. One fact, indeed, invests such a celebration with a special triumph. It is that while the government which was organized 100 years ago was unprecedented in form and wholly untried in the experience of states, and while it was regarded with interest but with incredulity as essentially unequal to the great shocks of fate to which other states have succumbed, it has passed, within the century, not only unshaken but strengthened, through the most tremendous and prolonged ordeal to which such a government could be submitted. Chief among its extraordinary good fortunes at its organization was that of the presence of a man without whom at that time its establishment would have been hardly possible. The French minister at the time of the inauguration wrote home to his government that it was the universal confidence in Washington which secured assent to the Constitution. John Lamb, who was unfriendly to the Constitution, told Hamilton in Wall Street that only his faith in Washington overcame his repugnance to it. The hour had plainly come for union, but except for the man it is probable that union would not then have been effected. The value of Washington to his country transcends that of any other man to any land. Take him from the Revolution, and all the fervor of the Sons of Liberty would seem to have been a wasted flame. Take him from the constitutional epoch, and the essential condition of union, personal confidence in a leader, would have been wanting. Franklin, when the work of the Constitutional Convention was completed, said that until then he had not been sure whether the sun depicted above the President's chair was a rising or a setting sun. But now his doubt was solved. Yet it was not the symbolic figure above the chair. It was the man within it who should have forecast the great result to that sagacious mind. From the moment that independence was secured, no man in America saw more clearly the necessity of national union, or defined more wisely and distinctly the reasons for it. He is the chief illustration in a popular government of a great leader who was not also a great orator. Perhaps that fact gave a solid force to his influence by depriving all his expressions of a rhetorical character, and preserving in them throughout a simplicity and moderation which deepened the impression of his comprehensive sagacity. He was felt as both an inspiring and a sustaining power in the preliminary movement for union, and by natural selection he was both president of the convention and the head of government which it instituted. John Adams was vice president, and Hamilton and Jefferson were in the cabinet. After Washington himself, they were the three most eminent figures in the country. But it is not possible to conceive any one of them organizing and establishing the new system without controversy which would have rent it asunder. Indeed, this year commemorates the auspicious beginning of the most arduous task which devolved upon Washington, and which transcends that to which any other man in history has been called. Yet how little in his performance of that task his countrymen would change. During the course of the century they have been divided largely upon views of the Constitution and upon principles of administration, and have engaged in a long and momentous civil war. But they would certainly not desire that any chief act of Washington's administration should have been other than it was. He acted without precedent, but with the calm majesty of rectitude, and although the serpent of party spirit struck at him as he retired, no honest partisan today either distrusts his motives or doubts his wisdom. It is a benignant fortune that so great a celebration as that of this year is an act of homage to so great a man. It was his happiness to know the affectionate reverence in which he was held. The memoirs and letters of the time show that Washington's was not a tardy and posthumous greatness, but that those who knew him best honored him most, and that America was conscious of the worth of her chief citizen. One of the most striking contemporary personal tributes to him is that of John Bernard, the English actor who was in this country at the close of the last century, and who met Washington near the end of his life by chance and without knowing him near Mount Vernon. Bernard had paid a visit to a friend upon the banks of the Potomac, and was returning upon horseback to Alexandria behind a chaise which seemed to be in difficulties and was presently upset. The actor hastened to the rescue simultaneous with another horseman, and after some exertions they succeeded in placing the occupants of the chaise, a man and a woman who were fortunately not injured, again upon their way. After their departure, Bernard's companion politely offered to dust his coat, and in returning the favor Bernard made a close survey of his companion. He was a tall, erect, well-made man, evidently advanced in years, but who seemed to have retained all the vigor and elasticity resulting from a life of temperance and exercise. His dress was a blue coat buttoned to his chin and buckskin breeches. Though the instant he took off his hat I could not avoid the recognition of familiar lineaments, which indeed I was in the habit of seeing on every signpost and on every fireplace, still I failed to identify him. Washington recognized Bernard as the actor whom he had the pleasure of seeing perform in Philadelphia during the previous winter, and after some pleasant chat, an invitation to ride with him to Mount Vernon, only a mile distant, revealed to Bernard the name of his companion. He was profoundly impressed, and upon reaching Mount Vernon they found that Mrs. Washington was indisposed, and the general ordered refreshments into a little parlor looking upon the Potomac. At some length his guest describes the commanding presence of Washington, in which a feeling of awe and veneration stole over you. During a conversation of an hour and a half he touched on every topic that I brought before him with an even current of good sense, if he embellished it with a little wit or verbal elegance. When I mentioned to him the difference I perceived between the inhabitants of New England and of the Southern States, he remarked, "I esteem those people greatly. They are the stamina of the Union and its greatest benefactors. They are continually spreading themselves to settle and enlighten less favored quarters. Dr. Franklin is a New Englander. When I remarked that his observations were flattering to my country, he replied with great good humor, 'Yes, yes, Mr. Bernard, but I consider your country the cradle of free principles, not their armchair. Liberty in England is a sort of idol. People are bred up in the belief and love of it, but see little of its doings. They walk about freely, but then it is between high walls, and the error of its government was in supposing that after a portion of their subjects had crossed the sea to live upon a common, they would permit their friends at home to build up those walls around them.'" A black coming in at this moment with a jug of spring water, I could not repress a smile, which the General at once interpreted. "This may seem a contradiction," he continued, "but I think you must perceive that it is neither a crime nor an absurdity. When we profess our fundamental principle, that liberty is the inalienable right of every man, we do not include madmen or idiots. Liberty in their hands would become a scourge. Till the mind of the slave has been educated to perceive what are the obligations of a state of freedom, and not to confound a man's with a brute's, the gift would ensure its abuse. We might as well be asked to pull down our old warehouses before trade is increased to demand enlarged new ones. Both houses and slaves were bequeathed to us by Europeans, and time alone can change them, an event, sir, which you may believe me, no man desires more heartily than I do. Not only do I pray for it on the score of human dignity, but I can clearly foresee that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our Union, by consolidating it in a common bond of principle. At the end of a century which has vindicated his views so nobly and so completely, It is pleasant to read these words, and in this new and vivid glimpse of our Washington, to find only a stronger title to our veneration. Bernard recalls the words of de Chastellux: "The great characteristic of Washington is the perfect union which seems to subsist between his moral and physical qualities, so that the selection of one would enable you to judge of all the rest. If you are presented with medals of Trajan or Caesar, the features will lead you to inquire the proportions of their persons; but if you should discover in a heap of ruins the leg or arm of an antique Apollo, you would not be curious about the other parts, but content yourself with the assurance that they were all conformable to those of a god." End of chapter 24. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 25 of From the Easy Chair, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. From the Easy Chair, Volume 2, by George William Curtis. Chapter 25. Statues in Central Park, in 1889. The Easy Chair recently spoke of the statue of Longfellow, which has been erected in the city of Portland, where he was born, and Charter Oak, writing from Connecticut, asks why there is as yet no statue of Washington Irving in Central Park, the beautiful sylvan resort of his native city of New York. It is a question which the Easy Chair has already asked, and which must constantly suggest itself in the spacious public grounds which are becoming the most comprehensive of Valhallas. The London Times calls Westminster Abbey our Valhalla, meaning that of England only, but the pleasure ground of New York is truly a pantheon. It is dedicated to all the gods except its own. With unwonted metropolitan modesty, the city honors especially those who are not children of New York. Webster is there, but not John Jay; Shakespeare and Scott and Burns and Dante and Halleck even, but not Irving. It is grotesque that a space set apart in New York for recreation, and decorated with marbles and bronzes commemorating illustrious men, and among them authors and statesmen, should still lack a fitting memorial of the greatest statesman and the greatest author who were born in the city. Webster's famous panegyric of Jay, that when the ermine of the Chief Justiceship fell upon his shoulders it touched nothing that was not as pure as itself, suggests that a statue of John Jay might be of peculiar service as an object of admonitory meditation in the Bowery seclusion of a city that more recently contemplated a statue to Tweed. In Couture's picture of the decadence of the Romans, behind the luxurious and voluptuous groups of intoxicated revellers in the foreground, stand in sad severity the statues of the elder Romans surveying the scene. In the lofty aspect of Jay, filling with calm dignity the seclusion of some winding walk, would there be felt amazement and reproof? Is it to escape the sculptured rebuke of contrast with the civic heroes of today that it is not seen, and that the eye of the student who reflects that the city of New York has contributed few very great names to our history, seeks in vain the statue of John Jay in Central Park? Irving has every claim to this especial distinction. It is his kindly genius which made the Annals of New Amsterdam the first work of our creative literature, and which invested the great river of New York with imperishable romance. Undoubtedly he wrote those annals in characters of rollicking fun, and even over the heroism of the doughty Peter Stuyvesant he has cast a humorous halo. But not all our authors combined are so identified with New York as Irving. His earlier squib of Salmagundi treats "the town" with an arch memory of the spectator loitering in London, and his spell was such that in a later day Dennett, in The Nation, happily nicknamed the work of the talent which he had quickened the Knickerbocker literature. The same genius in a tenderer mood colored the shores of the Hudson with the softest hues of legend. The banks of Tarrytown stretching backward to Sleepy Hollow, the broad water of the Tappan Zee, the airy heights of the summer Catskill, were mere landscape, pleasing scenery only until Irving suffused them with the rosy light of story, and gave them the human association which is the crowning charm of landscape. In many a scene 100 mountain ranges survey the lower land far reaching to the ocean. The scene is grand but nameless, bare of tradition, and forgotten. But where the mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. The eye and the heart are enchanted with the story of Greece and its heroic human associations. In the first century of our literature, which is ending, very few of our authors have laid this legendary spell upon American scenes as Irving did upon the Hudson. They have not much endeared the country to the popular imagination, like Burns and Scott in Scotland, where every hill and stream and bird and flower is reflected individually and fondly in tale and song. The Easy Chair once met at Niagara a young Scotchman who had come straight from his native land, and at every turn and glimpse upon Goat Island and along the banks of the river he fairly bubbled and murmured with the music of Burns and the other poets about Scottish streams and scenes, of which he was reminded at every step. So, in his Poems of Places, Longfellow reveals the charm which literature imparts to scenery, a charm which he illustrates in his Nuremberg and Belfry at Bruges, and in his Lost Youth with its beautiful pictures of Portland, a poem which probably gives to a larger number of persons a more distinct and pleasing interest in that delightful city than anything else connected with it. Irving is the magician who has cast this glamour upon New York, the roaring mart of trade, the humming hive of industry. He shows us in these crowded and hurried streets the leisurely forms of old Dutch burghers, their comely wives and buxom daughters, and their tranquil existence. Upon this very spot, which thus becomes a palimpsest, one life overriding another, he awakens a romantic interest which gives it an endless fascination. He is thus a universal benefactor. His Rip Van Winkle, indolent but kindly vagabond that he is, asserts the charm of a loitering life in the woods and fields, against all the tremendous energy and lucrative devotion to dollars, the overpowering crowd and crushing competition of the whirring emporium. It is not necessary to defend poor Rip or justify him as a moral exemplar. Pax, good zeal in the land busy. But how soothing, as we mop our brows in the ardent struggle, and waste our lives in the furious accumulation of the means of living, to behold that figure stretched by the brook, or pleasing the children, or sauntering homeward at sunset. Other figures allure us, but still he holds his place. The new writers create their worlds. The new standards, another literary spirit, a fresh impulse, appear all around us. But still Rip Van Winkle lounges idly by, an unwasted figure of the imagination, the first distinct creation of our literature, the constant unconscious satirist of our life. The edicts of fortune are caprices. Halleck, who sang of Marco Bozzaris, has his statue in the park. Bryant still awaits his, and Irving, first of all, is without his memorial. The Germans have justly honored Humboldt in our Valhalla. The Scotch have commemorated Burns. The Italians have given to it Mazzini. The Puritan Pilgrim, ancestor of distinctive America, New England in bronze, is properly there. But where, asks the thoughtful child, reading the epitaphs in the graveyard, where be the bad people buried? Those whom the statues recall are all well and wisely honored in this most cosmopolitan of countries and of cities. But where, amid Germans and Italians and Scotchmen and great New Englanders, where be the New Yorkers? End of chapter 25.